Just gonna preface this before I start. I love Paradox games. Playing Paradox games don't make you a bad person, and this video is in no way attempting to hashtag cancel Paradox. Just remember what the Dark Mother always says.
That it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects.
Hi, I'm Al from Al's Toy Barn, and this is Tristan Won't Shut Up. I'm going to start by talking about a board game, but it's important, hear me out. It's called Puerto Rico, and it's one of the most famous in the Euro style of board games that have become very popular these days. But it is, when you boil down and look at the mechanics and everything involved, a slavery simulator. I have a friend who's really into tabletop, and he told me to look at it when I was making my video on Puerto Rico. And oh boy, and this game's not alone in sort of the European board game atmosphere. There are a lot of games that have a lot of problematic assumptions about development and technology and the enslavement and exploitation of resources and indigenous people. It's enough to make me think that the CIA is making all these European board games and these Paradox games and such to keep the Europeans' innate need to conquer and colonize under control. Or what I will call it, the busy box theory of European politics. But today, because I love their games so much, and because there's a new one coming out with Crusader Kings 3, we're going to talk about Paradox's grand strategy series of titles, except for Imperator Rome, because I haven't bought it, and it doesn't look very good. So I actually really like Paradox's grand strategy titles. I literally wrote an essay for Public History about how the Paradox titles do a really great job of simulating history using not the direct events that happen, but using the mechanics, the trends and forces of the age to show the sort of incentives that caused things in the past to happen the way they did. Yeah, I'm that kind of cool person who wrote an essay in school about Paradox games. And as far as I can tell from like my Discord and stuff, Paradox games have introduced a lot of people to history, and they become interested in history. Definitely way more than my videos. I personally got into Paradox games back in 2012, when Crusader Kings 2 first came out. But since then, I have probably sunk over 1,000 hours into Paradox games in general. Victoria 2, Hearts of Iron 3 and 4, Crusader Kings 2, Europa Universalis 4, Stellaris. I've spent a lot of time playing Stellaris. Just trying to think about how much more successful Step Back would be if I just never played Paradox games. But I have to say, Paradox does suffer from some Eurocentric assumptions that are baked into it, and some problematic aspects that it shares with a lot of strategy titles, as well as the 4X genre, although this is grand strategy. Plus there's this like capitalist Eurocentric teleology to it that I want to talk about with you today. I want to also say that some of the changes that have happened to the games over the years and some of the new features that are being added in Crusader Kings 3 make me think that they are moving in this direction, which is pretty good. So really I want this video to be just a little bit of a learning moment. I love that Crusader Kings 2 showed the chaos that comes with a feudal society, or how Victoria 2's complex modeling of economies and commodities shows the incentives that led to the horrific conquest of the peoples of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So first, let's talk about Eurocentrism. If you were to look at any of the Paradox Grand Strategy games, the modeling of European countries is by far the thing they put the most development energy into. It gets better as you get closer to the present. Like I think Hearts of Iron 4 does a lot better work of modeling non-European countries, better than any of the other games. But there is still an emphasis that Europe is the center of world history, and that the complexities of the game are on modeling Europe in general. Like for example, every game that seems to have the Holy Roman Empire in it, they have to do this complex modeling just to cover the Holy Roman Empire. And it's like, man, there's probably some other places in the world where some intricate modeling of the stuff going on might be useful. But for example, in Europa Universalis 4, EU4, the modeling of European cultures at the expense of, say, like indigenous cultures in the Americas or in Australia are so extensive that the colonization process feels very simplified and unrealistic, to a point that I think is a little unfair to the indigenous cultures who live there. Now, they did do an expansion for indigenous cultures, but it doesn't really come close to the way they do European stuff. For example, a lot of non-white religions in Europa Universalis 4 are simply dumbed down to either being animist or totemist. And in Crusader Kings 2, one of the religions is just African. Crusader Kings 3 is apparently fixing that, which is good, but holy moly. Another thing that I remember is that when Europa Universalis first came out, the way the technology functioned was basically creation of these different tech groups. And the way that it worked was just that the less white you were, the more your technology was dumbed down and slower. And the only way to fix that was to westernize your country. Today, they've replaced it with a system that is centered around unique inventions, but those inventions are still far more likely to show up in Europe than anywhere else. Another thing is that there's 3 branches of technology that just go up, which is not how technology works, obviously. If you want an example of the kinds of problems that come with sort of a simplistic idea of technology like that, I recommend that you check out my video called The Truth About Native Americans Before Europeans Arrive to show that our notions of technological development being like better in one place than another can sometimes lead to problematic assumptions that lead to assumptions of people just being less developed than others. Now, this I don't think is intentional, but there are mechanics in the game that attempt to manage different types of the issues of imperialism and conquest that lead to what I can only describe as a fascist impulse. Now, this is not unique to Paradox. It's in a bunch of strategy games, but let me just go through a bit of this and let me see what you think. The first example that comes up is that in a lot of the Paradox games, the optimal strategy to play to become an empire is to make your country ethnically homogenous, which usually means pushing buttons like the convert culture button, which is a funny way of saying ethnic cleansing. And despite the developers' efforts, map painting, conquering as much territory as possible, is still seen as the default way to play, which means that the best strategy to play is to conquer territory, commit ethnic cleansing, push people out, push your culture in, and keep growing, i.e. fascism. It doesn't simulate very well the downsides of doing things like that and the upsides of cooperation and cultural diversity, which there are plenty. The only game I can think of that makes diversity actually a good thing is Stellaris, where you can have different species that live in different ecosystems so that you can colonize more planets. And in games where they have to model actual fascist countries like Italy and Germany, they don't really do the work to show the self-destructive impulses that are baked into this ideology. They don't model things like the costs that are involved in the subjugation and eventual genocide of 24 million people. As well, it doesn't talk about the growing centralization of authority within fascist societies until they are so top-heavy they become unstable and fall apart. And then they don't talk about, like, for example, Nazi Germany making bad decisions because they were white supremacists and thinking that Slavs were weak-willed or whatever crap they think up in that stuff. And so what this leads to is a modeling of fascism that makes it look like it's, powerful and belligerent. And I would almost say cool, because they just don't talk about all of the dark shit.
How about we keep this whole Holocaust talk out of this discussion about military history and talk about how the King Tiger was freaking epic. Oh boy, that maneuver through the Ardennes sure was daring. Something, Rommel?
Crusader Kings 2, a game I've spent lots of hours playing, incentivizes centralizing power and becoming more authoritarian and having direct control over your territory. And so centralizing power to a single ruler is the ideal form of running things. There is even one point a few patches ago where they didn't bake in enough penalties for holding too many titles, that people were doing something called North Korea mode, where all of the titles would just be held by one person and you could just blob out that way. Another thing is that Paradox games and strategy games in general tend to have a very capitalist idea of what progress is. In many strategy games, and these Paradox games are no exception, conquest and expansion, as well as the increasing of industrial productiveness, is seen as universally good with little to no downsides. Technological development tends to focus on weapons and industrial capacity, but either way, baked into a lot of these assumptions about progress and conquest is this idea of infinite growth. It's the same type of thinking that makes us all think that we need to go to a dead rust ball like Mars and start living there despite it having no real resources for us to use. And that's because they made a game in a capitalist society, and so in a capitalist society, we're raised to think that the good things are the things that make money and the things that are about growth and good quarterly expansion. It's not about sustainability. It's not about harmony. It's about expansion. Another thing that's common with strategy games is that because you play typically as a state, you start to see the world as a state. In some ways, that's good. You can kind of play all of the Paradox games in order and see this story of the structure of society going from powerful individuals ruling as autocrats, moving towards more and more centralized authority and bureaucracy and establishing more of a government. And then watching all of those governments tear themselves apart in the flames and wheels of World War II. Very often, those who impede progress are written off as nameless rebels, and the causes and the things that they're angry about are little more than a roadblock towards the advancement of the state towards ever more conquest and expansion. As well, if you frame a game as a bunch of countries as players in a competitive game, you're essentially baking into the mechanics social Darwinism. The idea that all societies are fundamentally at odds with each other, and that in the long run, there's going to be one winner, and everybody else will be destroyed. This is a competitive game, so all friends become eventual competition. This impulse of conquering and map painting and competition between countries makes me think that this is the reason why we haven't been able to have a good Paradox game that takes place during the Cold War, because that would be more about coalition building and alliance building and organizations and political revolutions, all of the things that Paradox games don't do super well. Colonization in Paradox games is usually set up to be unambiguously good and beneficial for everybody involved. The destruction of indigenous cultures and stuff like that is a footnote in the game. And because that's baked into the AI of how countries work, it means that all the countries across the world all sort of act like little European countries. Because a colonial mindset is something that is very, very much baked into the European Western culture. There's a lot of alternative history fiction that works like this too, where you can tell a white person wrote it, because things like China setting up colonies in California doesn't really make a lot of sense for a country that doesn't have a long history of setting up colonies. So there is something a bit like Eurocentric about just assuming that all countries at default must think like Westerners. And I think that the mechanics themselves have attracted a certain audience that I think Paradox has had a lot of issues dealing with. It's sort of the elephant in the room of Paradox fandom that there's a lot of Nazis. Crusader Kings 2 is actually like one of the most popular video games with the alt-right. CK2 might be to blame for the reason why Deus Vult, which was a slogan used during the Crusades, became a meme to express Western civilization's war against Islam, despite the fact that, Muslims spent most of the Middle Ages being way more versed in Western canon than Europeans were. And in many ways, one of the major problems of Crusader Kings 2 that makes it appeal to the alt-right is that it sees different religious groups as fundamentally in competition with each other. With the exception of the Indian subcontinent, there's this idea that, for example, Christians and Muslims are fundamentally at odds. There's no way of solving any of their problems, and that there's no coexistence, despite all of the evidence of coexistence that happened. This results in, like in Crusader Kings 2, for example, the Iberian Peninsula's politics making absolutely no sense, because that region spent centuries with Muslims and Christians and Jews living together, actually having pretty good cooperation with each other for a long time under the kingdoms of Andalusia. Seeing Christianity and Islam as fundamentally in conflict in Crusader Kings 2 is not only ahistorical, but it feeds into a right-wing narrative that is very prevalent in our day and age. And so the alt-right really into CK2. Paradox is always having to deal with historical accuracy mods in Hearts of Iron 4. People trying to add swastikas. There was that whole issue where someone made a mod for Stellaris that replaced all of the human portraits with white people, and the description was just this long racist screed. And even though it was a bit of a meme at the time, it's real uncomfortable by today's standards. One of their marketing things was literally red hats that said, "Make space great again." And the Stellaris fandom is full of memes that have to do with genocide and extermination and all that kind of stuff, and it's super disturbing. And the barely contained xenophobia that is part of Stellaris, where the veneer of racism can be taken off because it's aliens, leads to just like tons of memes that if they're applied to humans would be like something you'd see on 8chan. But that being said, all of the updates I've seen to Paradox games coming out in the last few years have made me very optimistic about where things are going to go. The changes in Crusader Kings 3, especially when it comes to religion and stability and sort of nuancing a lot of the different ethnicities and such like that has made me think that they are going in the right direction. And the reason I'm talking about this is because video games are media, and when we don't experience something directly, media is the only intermediary that we have to have those other experiences. This is why reading is great for developing your empathy, reading about other people's experiences. The past doesn't exist anymore. It's in the past. And so media is really the only thing we can do to understand the past. And for a lot of people, history video games like Paradox games are their only vision into a past that no longer exists. The games do teach a lot of history, and the research they do is pretty good. I'm very happy that Paradox has introduced so many people to the past and taught them about history in a way that no textbook really could. But at the same time, it has modern day, capitalist, eurocentric mindsets baked into the code of the game. It leads to a lot of the biggest departures from history that are in the series, and in doing so, for a lot of people's only experience of this history, paints a very bad picture about, what are the previous examples of things that worked. And in many ways, the assumption is that a modern, centralized capitalist economy is the default. That is how the world should work. And it's not their fault. I mean, they are products of the capitalist society we live in. I'm not accusing anybody of bigotry. What I'm saying is that there's a bit of a lack of imagination going on here, and that with a bit of work, there could be some really, really cool games that come out of it that not only show us how the past functioned in a way that really shows the examples and the ways the world worked, but also don't make assumptions that give ahistorical fuel to reactionaries and bigots. Thank you all for watching. This is a brand new channel, so if you like this stuff, you should subscribe to watch more. I make videos every week, and I want to thank my wonderful patrons who make this video possible. If you want to help out, go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and pledge as low as $1 a month. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all next time.